Like all New Years, 1971 was born with inherited defects and launched on a stream of soaring hopes. By year's end, those who relied on extravagant dreams would naturally be disappointed. To be sure, 1971 saw many personal triumphs in the professions and the arts. The John F. Kennedy Center opened in Washington, and Americans won a share of the Nobel Prizes. But the ultimate Peace Prize was as elusive as ever. In the early days of 1971, Americans were watching Cambodia, where U.S. forces supported efforts to clean out Viet Cong's supply lines. The Cambodian incursion of the year before was still debated. The voices in the debate were part of the real and unrehearsed sounds of the news of 1971. The president could point to statistics to show the Cambodian operation was a success. From the Congress, these voices were heard. Senators Mike Mansfield.
I'm disturbed about Cambodia. I hope it isn't the beginning of step up in the war, but at the present time, I'm uneasy, concerned, and disturbed.
Stuart Symington.
The operation is going farther, in my opinion, than we were understood from the statements that were made on the 30th of June it was going to be.
John Stennis.
North Vietnamese could be more successful than they have been so far in their efforts to control this vital territory there, and if so, we'd have to step up our support.
George McGovern.
Any senator who talks about sending American forces into Cambodia ought to lead the charge himself. I'm fed up to the ears with old men dreaming up wars for young men to die in, particularly stupid wars of this kind.
After several weeks of a news blackout from Laos, another incursion was outlined on February 8th by Robert McCloskey, a State Department official.
No American ground combat forces or advisors will cross into Laos. The operation will be a limited one, both as to time and area. The Vietnamese government has made it clear that its objective will be to disrupt those forces which have been concentrated in this region for use against South Vietnamese and United States forces.
Ground troops would not be involved, but our air support would be massive, according to Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird.
We will use air power. And as long as I am serving in this job, I will recommend that we use air power.
Senator Henry Jackson saw it as a testing ground for the Vietnamese.
If the South Vietnamese can't carry out this kind of an operation, it's a tough one, then I think it puts into question their ability to defend their own country. They've done quite well in Cambodia. This is what we've been training them for.
The further disengagement of U.S. troops, despite the apparent increase in fighting, was part of the president's plan to Vietnamize the war. Secretary of State William Rogers was able to defend it with enthusiasm.
The president has made a firm commitment to the American people to pursue the policy of Vietnamization that he's pursued so successfully. All our budgetary planning is based on that premise. Vietnamization is working very well.
Vietnamization means war and more war.
Senator Edward Kennedy.
It has nothing to do with an end to violence. It is a policy of violence. It is possible that we will, under Vietnamization, eventually reduce our involvement in Vietnam, only to step back to watch the ultimate agony of that place while washing our hands of it.
In a television address in April, the president announced further withdrawals, but the one thing most critics wanted to hear, a specific date when the war would end, was not mentioned. Democratic Senator Robert Byrd defended the president.
He did not state a definite date, but I have the very distinct impression from what was said that the president has a date in mind. I don't think he should state it publicly. I've maintained all along that that would play into the hands of the enemy. I think that if he has a date, and I hope he has a date, that he will not state it publicly, but I do wish that he would have said publicly that he does have a date in mind.
During the Laos incursion, Group W's Paul Steinle in Saigon spoke with the pilots who were giving support to the ARVN ground troops.
Personally, I feel they should have started an operation like this several years ago, same as a Cambodian operation. If they'd have gone ahead and forced this particular war, I feel it probably would have been over within the last 2 or 3 years quite easily.
How do you feel about supporting the ARVN?
They've improved 100%. They're really doing a job this time.
In Washington, the Vietnamese were thought to have passed the test, and the operation was officially considered a success by President Nixon.
General Abrams tells me that in both Laos and in Cambodia, his evaluation after 3 weeks of fighting is that, to use his terms, the South Vietnamese by themselves can hack it, and they can give a better account of themselves even than the North Vietnamese units.
That particular operation in Laos lasted 44 days, cost $350 million, and did not slow down our troop withdrawal. Secretary Laird expressed cautious optimism and was contradicted by Senator Ed Muskie.
I believe that the Laotian operation, when it is the final judgment can be rendered on it, will show that it did have the effect of disrupting and making very difficult during this period of time the vast amount of supplies which the enemy needed in 3 and 4 Corps and also in Cambodia.
The South Vietnamese armies have been forced to pull back across the border. They did not hold long enough to seriously interrupt the flow of supplies. The South Vietnamese casualty rate is estimated for the 20,000 South Vietnamese troops that were involved at something between 25 and 50%. Casualty rates of that scope indicate nothing less than a serious military defeat.
The differing conclusions raise the question again of government credibility on the war's progress.
There'll be a real persistent militant attempt to stop the functioning of the government the first week in May. And the groups all around the country have been preparing for 6 or 7 months, getting old cars together.
This threat from Abby Hoffman, a leader in the anti-war protest movement, was among the boldest yet made by the militants. This was to be the Veterans' March on Washington, beginning around April 20th, which would swell to 200,000 young protesters and veterans by the 1st of May. A Supreme Court order denied them permission to camp on the Washington Mall, and their attorney, former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, made the announcement.
Well, I wish I had some good news for you, but I don't. I just heard orally from the clerk of the United States Supreme Court that I'm advised by the clerk that the order of Chief Justice Berger as of last night has been affirmed by the whole court.
Then, on April 22nd, John Kerry, organizer of the Veterans Against the War, a decorated Vietnam veteran, appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and made an eloquent appeal.
When 30 years from now our brothers go down the street without a leg, without an arm or a face, and small boys ask why, we will be able to say Vietnam, and not mean a desert, not a filthy, obscene memory, but mean instead the place where America finally turned and where soldiers like us helped it in the turning. Thank you.
New York's Bryant Park was the scene of another turnout. Newsman Doug Edelson of WINS caught these views reflecting the division at home over the war.
What is your chief objection to the people gathering here?
They're un-American.
In what way?
They're un-American in everything that they do. I believe that they're communists. I don't believe they're all commies. I believe the biggest portion of these kids are communist dupes, doing everything that the communists want them to do. Destroying our fighting power in Vietnam, eliminating any possible chance of a victory in Vietnam.
The Vietnam War is one of the tools the government uses to kill off its overpopulation. The Vietnam War is being used to spread American capitalism throughout Southeast Asia, thereby removing the people's wills for self-determination of their government and their society.
And now we are at the point where we can drive from the White House the man who is continuing the filthiest, most immoral war in history. Put our strength together, drive the lawmakers from the White House, drive them from the Congress, and see to it that this horrible, senseless, brutal war is brought to an end right now, right now, right now.
Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon commented in a different way.
We have all become desensitized by this war. Our conscience has become numb.
We blink at the TV pictures of Asian villagers who are maimed and burned by our bombs, and are relieved to see a mouthwash commercial flash on the screen after a few seconds. We would all rather worry about whether our breath is fresh than whether innocent people are dying in Asia as a result of our policies.
One man in America chose 1971 as the year for his own private protest against the war. He was part of a tiny elite group that worked on a secret study prepared for the Pentagon of our involvement in Vietnam. He was Daniel Ellsberg.
In the fall of 1969, I took the responsibility on my own initiative of delivering to the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate the information contained in the so-called Pentagon Papers, including the several studies on negotiations which have not been given to any newspaper. By this spring, 2 invasions later, and after 9,000 more Americans and hundreds of thousands more Indo-Chinese had died, I could only regret that I had not at that same time released that information to the American public through the newspapers. I have now done so.
The New York Times began publication of selections from the Pentagon Papers on June 13th. Reaction, as expected, was violent, emotional, and immediate. Senator Goldwater called it a major security leak.
I would have preferred to see the law used, arrest the principals and try them under the Espionage Act and test that law.
Secretary of State Rogers.
From my standpoint, it's going to cause a great deal of difficulty with governments outside the United States, with foreign governments.
I can't evaluate effect on foreigners. This morning's paper reports that no European country, at least, has protested, except, I think, the Greek colonels. And, of course, they have a very special relationship to our military establishment. But
Senator Fulbright.
That isn't what I think its real significance is. I think it's significant in that it emphasizes how the Congress, as an institution, has been excluded from participation in the formulation of our policies in foreign affairs. I think this has been a very great mistake, not just by this administration, but for the last 20 years.
Journalistic history was made when the Justice Department ordered an injunction against the Times on June 15th, and publication of the papers was stopped. Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger remarked,
I think it'll open a lot of people's eyes as to what happened during those years when all of the people in the press were apparently being told one story, and the people close to the government were having something else told to them.
There was outrage on both sides of the argument. Some argued that the papers were compiled by men with a bias against U.S. policy. Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska had the whole report incorporated in the congressional record. Then he addressed the Senate.
The papers do not support our public statements. The papers do not support our best intentions. The papers prove that for 20 years, and certainly for the last 10 years, we have been victims of our Southeast Asia policy, not masters of it. The greatest representative democracy the world has ever known. The nation of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln has had its nose rubbed in the swamp by petty warlords, jealous Vietnamese generals, black marketeers, and grand-scale dope pushers.
I got my orders for Vietnam, and I couldn't wait, you know. I couldn't wait to come over here because I heard how cheap and what good drugs, you know. I was like a kid in a candy store. You know?
1971 was the year the Vietnam drug story broke. In February and March, correspondent Paul Steinley broadcast a 7-part series that began to expose one more horror of the war in Indochina. His authority was Major General Mike Davison.
The heroin thing is really a horrendous problem in my judgment, and it's such a problem. It's a problem to the extent that it really sublimates any concern for marijuana.
Probably 10% of our soldiers, our young soldiers, are using heroin. Now, many people tell me that that's a conservative estimate. If we can't find some way to get them off their heroin habit, we're just unloading a problem on the people back home.
Stanley also spoke with a number of Vietnamese people who longed to settle the fate of their beleaguered country.
I think that in this war, no one can be victor over the other. This war only lead to destruction. Therefore, I think we have only two ways, coexistence or both destroyed.
I think that we should have a government, a Vietnamese government here, which would reflect the general aspiration of our people, which is peaceful.
So I think that the political problem is the key thing here.
I think that if we want to have peace, then we have to work directly with the people in the States, how to stop the U.S. government in their present policy.
One of the news stories that made 1971 memorable began to unfold in early April when an American table tennis team playing ping pong in a tournament in Japan accepted an invitation from the Chinese team to visit Peking. Group W station WBZ Boston completed a telephone call to Peking and spoke with Julian Schumann, a resident of China.
Premier Zhou Enlai, according to U.S. team leader, will meet the American delegation tomorrow afternoon. This morning they practiced and they will have the match with the Chinese will open at 2:30 Peking time this afternoon.
No one seemed to care who won the matches, but when the losing U.S. team got back to Paris, two of its members had opposing views of their Chinese hosts.
Coming away from that visit, I'm very pro-China, much more than I ever thought I would be. I was somehow even enchanted in a way by Peking, with its drabness, its dreariness. I came away with the idea that China has a dream, or that China has an ideal, you know?
I feel that when people are in this kind of environment, and when they are subject to environmental and political forces that make them this way, that they're being cheated out of their human heritage, and that there is more to life than simply following the leaders and being what I consider contented robots.
Group W station WIND in Chicago filed this story from a businessman.
We feel that with all the publicity given the ping pong players, that ping pong balls from Red China would be quite a novelty here in America, and we'd like to import about 1 million of them and see what happens.
In late April, the president remarked hopefully at a press conference,
"What we've done is broken the ice. Now we have to test the water to see how deep it is."
Dr. Henry Kissinger, the president's assistant for national security affairs, was sent to Peking secretly to verify the water's depth. Apparently it was not too deep for the president to take the plunge, which he announced dramatically on July 15th.
Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure. Our action in seeking a new relationship with the People's Republic of China will not be at the expense of our old friends.
American concern for Taiwan's future was repeated by every official source, including Speaker of the House Carl Albert, who visited Taipei in August on a trip scheduled before the president's China visit was announced.
We will not, and on this I speak as the elected leader of the people's body of the government, we will not abandon old friends.
After the announcement, a torrent of comment poured from every part of the world, particularly Japan, which had not been advised. In the Senate, reaction was polarized left, right, and center. Senator Fulbright.
Well, I was flabbergasted, surprised, but delighted and happy that the president's going to go to Peking.
Senator Dominic.
But it was a total disaster, unless there's a lot more about it than I know. I think that this is the first indication that the United States is going to acquiesce in the admission of Red China into the UN and perhaps even go as far as recognition.
Senator Mansfield.
My hopes are high because this could mark the end of an old era and the beginning of a new era.
On October 18th, a historic debate began in the General Assembly. Communist Albania offered a resolution to admit mainland China and expel nationalist China. the United States countered with a resolution to postpone a decision in order to eventually seat both Chinas. Ambassador George Bush defended the U.S. position.
Both sides agree that the People's Republic of China should be admitted. Both are in agreement on that point. And both agree that they should sit in the Security Council as a permanent member. And one fundamental point divides us, and that simply is whether to retain or whether to expel the Republic of China. And I submit that the course of expulsion, first, is most ill-advised and dangerous as a precedent in the United Nations. And second, it simply is an unacceptable price to pay for the entry of the People's Republic of China into this organization.
Bhutan? No. Bolivia?
Yes.
Yes. Botswana?
Abstain.
Abstention? Brazil?
Yes.
Yes. Bulgaria?
No.
No. Burma?
No.
No. Burundi?
No.
No. Belarus SSR? No. And Cameroon?
No.
No.
The vote went against the United States. Some say it was due to too much high-pressure salesmanship. And on November 11th, Americans heard for the first time the voices of the new Chinese ambassador to the UN, Xiao Quanhua, and his youthful translator on a runway at Kennedy Airport.
The Chinese people and the peoples of the world have always been friendly. The Chinese government has consistently stood for the establishment and development of normal relations with other countries on the basis of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Why should we pay 30 and 40% when we don't have 30 to 40% of the world's wealth or of the world's population? We are, I think, being played for Uncle Sap in some respects.
Senator Hugh Scott was not alone in his criticism. Our failure to alter the course of history at the United Nations was considered in many quarters as a major diplomatic defeat. It touched off a wave of resentment against the UN and most of the world in general, particularly among conservatives. Senator James Buckley had plenty to say about it.
This is as good a time as any to reassess how effectively our money, which is intended to help people in the developing countries, to assess whether it's being done efficiently through the UN, and if not, or if we have any reason for it.
Coincidentally, a foreign aid bill was before the Senate, and on October 30th, it was voted down, the first such defeat since 1947. Senator Sam Ervin was among the opposition.
We tried to retain in the United Nations a free in Taiwan, and 55 nations which had been receiving foreign aid from us and which was scheduled to receive $2 3/10 billion of additional aid under this bill either voted against us or refused to vote with us.
Even staunch liberal Democrats, such as Senator Frank Church, cast an appraising eye, not just on this bill, but in our massive and expensive program of aid to other nations.
If you look at the 10 years of foreign aid, during which we have spent more than $100 billion, you'll find that precious little progress has been made toward helping the people who need the help, even in Latin America. So the program is not accomplishing its purported purpose.
A modified foreign aid bill was finally hammered out on the final day of the 1971 congressional session. All in all, the mood of the country as the year ended was cool toward the rest of the world. Americans were looking inward.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm today announcing that I'm a candidate for the office of President of the United States.
1971 was not an election year, but everyone was running just the same to be ready for 72. The first to announce was Senator George McGovern, Democrat from South Dakota.
The kind of campaign I intend to run will rest on candor and reason. It will be rooted not in the manipulation of our fears and divisions, but in a national dialogue based on mutual respect.
Next was Congressman Paul McCloskey, Republican from California, who was accused of a dump Nixon campaign.
And I don't call it a dump Nixon movement, incidentally. I call it a Republican alternative, and there are a lot of aspects to it, like truth and honesty by the administration and moral leadership in the race issue and a little deeper commitment to the problems of the cities.
Throughout 1971, many election watchers and political surveys pronounced Senator Ed Muskie the Democratic frontrunner. In late July, Muskie talked with Group W correspondent Jerry Udwin.
Whether or not, a senator from Maine has enough political versatility and a broad enough appeal to make a political impact, and a successful one in all of these different political environments, is the great political obstacle that stands between now and a year from now.
By fall, one active presidential hopeful, Birch Bayh, dropped out of the running due to his wife's health. Senator Edward Kennedy insisted,
I'm one of the few members of the Senate who isn't running for higher office.
Any politician who honestly didn't want to run could have taken a leaf from the Academy Award presentations when Goldie Hawn took the floor.
George C. Scott in Patton, James Earl Jones, The Great White Hope, Melvin Douglas in I Never Sang for My Father, Ryan O'Neal in Love Story, Jack Nicholson in 5 Easy Pieces. The envelope, please. Oh, my God. The winner is George C. Scott.
Scott didn't even show up at the ceremony to decline the honor. Of equal suspense was Mayor John Lindsay's long-awaited announcement that came on August 11th.
Today, the Republican Party has moved so far from what I perceive as necessary policies for our city and for the country that I can no longer try to work within it. I joined the Democratic Party today because it offers the best hope for a change in national direction and national leadership in the 1972 election.
No formal announcement for the presidency followed that switch. November 19th, Senator Henry Jackson, Democrat of Washington, put in his bid.
The number one priority in this country must be to put our people back to work. That will not happen until we put a man in the White House who is trusted. Mr. Nixon is not that man. I think I can be that man.
I think that the blood of the life of a soldier costs more expensive than the seat of the president. I don't like to exchange the blood and the life of my soldier against the votes for the next election.
1971 was an election year in Vietnam. As the months passed, it was obvious the war-ravaged country would not hold an American-style election. The powerful Thieu government outmaneuvered and outraged opposition.
Once again, it became clear that the law was interpreted differently according to the needs of each moment. The nation is now placed in a crisis which can bring about great peril if it remains unresolved. The storm is near.
Thieu campaigned on a solid anti-communist platform. Outraged by Thieu's tactics, the other candidates, General Duong Van Minh and Vice President Nguyen Cao Ky, withdrew in anger. Ky was asked if a coup might be in order.
Who knows the reactions of the soldiers? Even President Thieu doesn't know exactly what will be their reactions. And even the ambassador, Bunker, does not know.
U.S. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker tried to prevail upon General Minh to run, even as a straw man. But this was an impossibility for Minh, according to a friend and spokesman.
Well, he failed because he asked General Minh to do something dishonorable and dishonest in the eyes of the Vietnamese people. Ambassador Bunker, in fact, asked General Minh to accept to lose the election and serve as a window dressing for President Thieu.
So in November, a confused populace voted Thieu back into office. Correspondent Paul Steinley spoke with a couple of GIs about the election.
I think the original idea that we came over here was to preserve the South Vietnamese people's right to make their own choice, but I don't think we're doing that.
It's not democratic. And that's what they're trying to get over here, right? Right now we're fighting for nothing.
During 1971, nearly everything went up except ladies' hemlines and men's hairlines. The fashion look was right out of a 1940 spy movie. Makeup, wedgies, clinging dresses with broad shoulders, topped by a ragged haircut, and that item long absent from fashion, a lady's hat. Other items went up during the year: wages, prices, rents, the cost of money, and the demands of union leaders.
There just isn't any game plan, Mr. President, on this
anti-inflation program. I don't like to use the
Senator
word
Hubert Humphrey.
game plan because they make it appear as if this is a rather joyful experience. The fact of the matter is the administration does not have a concerted, comprehensive, integrated economic policy. It's hit and miss.
After many promises of strong measures throughout the spring and summer, the President spoke to the nation on August 15th and announced measures never before taken in peacetime.
I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days. In addition, I call upon corporations to extend the wage price freeze to all dividends. I will propose to provide the strongest short-term incentive in our history to invest in new machinery and equipment that will create new jobs for Americans. I will propose to repeal the 7% excise tax on automobiles, effective today. I propose to speed up the personal income tax exemption scheduled for January 1, 1973 to January 1, 1972. To offset the loss of revenue from these tax cuts, which directly stimulate new jobs, I have ordered today a $4.7 billion cut in federal spending. As a temporary measure, I am today imposing an additional tax of 10% on goods imported into the United States.
As expected, criticism was sharp among senators who opposed the president. Hubert Humphrey.
The one glaring weakness of the president's economic plan is it doesn't take into consideration anything but the immediate crisis. It does not look to the future, nor does it provide for any of the social needs of our country in housing and health or in education. What it is, at best, is a Band-Aid on a running sore.
Fred Harris.
The two main failings I see in the president's economic plan newly announced is, one, the fact that there are not going to be jobs there because there's no public service job program, and secondly, that the tax advantages are to the wealthy and to the large corporations.
Alan Cranston.
I hope that also there will be efforts to deal with the environmental problems and the neglect problems at home.
Henry Jackson.
Well, I don't see any point in the president announcing the end of a 90-day freeze without being able to say what follows after the 90-day freeze.
The loudest opposition came from labor in the person of George Meany, who addressed the House Ways and Means Committee on September 13th.
Why shouldn't the corporations chip in a little more? Why should everything be taken out of the hide of the ordinary Joe? Everything put on the back of the fellow who works for wages. That's why we're for it on the ground of equity. Let the corporations give up a little.
Race is in reverse.
They don't care. They don't care a thing about those kids.
They're not going to stop this strike.
The labor picture throughout 1971 had already been a stormy one. A strike of 13,000 railroad signalmen on May 17th had been terminated in 2 days by an act of Congress at the president's request. Labor Secretary Hodgson was annoyed.
How often must a busy Congress be forced to divert its attention from pressing national problems solely to get our trains back on the tracks? We have needed, we need now, and we certainly will need in the future a new way to solve these problems.
Phone installers, taxi drivers, and fuel truck drivers struck in New York City. And across the river in Newark, one of the bitterest, saddest strikes dragged on through most of the spring term, the teacher strike. Some teachers were arrested, and most of the others felt Mayor Kenneth Gibson had betrayed their interests. The reporter was Paul Parker.
I think the strike is good, and I think the arrest of these teachers is ridiculous. It's just tyranny.
And the most important thing is that the mayor broke his promise. He agreed to accept the mediator's decision. He broke his promise.
They feel he's now employing...
We have a mayor in Newark. We have an idiot in Newark.
They feel that everybody, black and white, he is a traitor. He is a phony. He is nothing.
Black bourgeois have taken over the white bourgeois job now. Those aren't no bourgeois. What bourgeois? They just one generation from the wash tubs. That's their problem.
Race is in reverse.
On June 1st, the steelworkers signed a new contract with Alcoa that included a 31% increase. Ray Pasnick spoke for the union.
A 3-year agreement has been reached with the Aluminum Company of America, providing for substantial wage increases, cost of living provision, unlimited incidentally, insurance and pension improvements, and major breakthroughs in vacation scheduling and weekend premium pay.
Miners, too, were out for their share. Ken Yablonsky.
So the coal miner is entitled to much more than just the vague statements about $50 a day and no more. The miner needs sick pay, he needs improved vacations, The grievance procedure is going to have to be overhauled. There are just a multitude of...
Organized labor and the administration were on a collision course. Following a meeting between union and federal officials, Meany ridiculed the labor secretary in particular and the administration in general.
Oh, well, I don't pay too much attention to the secretary after all, and he was there this morning, and I didn't even bother discussing it with him because, final analysis, if you have a problem with the landlord, you don't discuss it with the janitor.
Management and labor endured the freeze despite the rhetoric. Meanwhile, the intricate network of foreign exchange that keeps world trade moving had come unstuck, following our refusal to convert dollars to gold, our unpegging the value of our money, our 10% surcharge on all imports. After months of speculation, President Nixon agreed as the year closed to devalue the dollar and to get rid of the 10% surcharge. The historic move would go a long way toward solving the world economic crisis. Earlier, on October 7th, the President announced Phase 2 of his economic policy.
I'm appointing a price commission to hold down prices. It will be made up of persons outside of government, all public members, not beholden to any special interest group. The price commission will develop yardsticks and will be empowered to restrain price and rent increases to the necessary minimum and to prevent windfall profits. I'm also appointing a pay board to stop inflationary wage and salary increases, the kind of increases that don't really benefit the working man. The pay board will be made up of representatives of labor, management, and the public. Both the price commission and the pay board will seek voluntary cooperation from business and labor, but they will be backed by the authority of law to make their decisions stick.
Again, the loudest voice raised against the President's extraordinary economic strategy came not from big industry, but from big labor, which categorically opposed anything that might keep wages down. At a convention in Florida, George Meany minced no words.
If Phase 2 fails, political expediency demands a scapegoat. The man in the White House never says it's my fault. No politician ever says it's his fault. The trade unions of America can expect to be the objects of such attention and the targets of this type of power. All the more so if labor is to stand alone in the struggle.
The following day, the President replied.
Now, I have noted that President Meany's had some things to say about Phase 2. Matter of fact, it's a little hard not to note what he's had to say. Yesterday, in speaking before your convention, he, as he should do, criticized Phase 2, criticized the makeup of the pay board and the price commission, and criticized the Committee on Interest Rates and so forth. And then he said, quote, if the President of the United States doesn't want our membership on the pay board on our terms, he knows what he can do. Well, you know, President Meany is correct. I know exactly what I can do, and I'm going to do it. It is my obligation as President of the United States to make this program of stopping the rise in the cost of living succeed. And to the extent that my powers allow it, I shall do exactly that.
As the Wage Board and the Pay Board began to cope with the wage price cycle, most observers felt that some very sizable increases for both sides were allowed. Several large pay and price increases were granted. Wilbur Mills summed it up.
The administration's economic record is a consistent one of no runs, no hits, and plenty of errors. I hope it will get back on base with this new economic policy, and I'll continue to do all that I can to help it to do so.
This is Dick Stockton with a perspective on sports for the year 1971. On New Year's Day, the favorites in college football were toppled as Texas lost to Notre Dame in the Cotton Bowl, Stanford shocked Ohio State in the Rose, and when Nebraska beat LSU in Miami's Orange Bowl, the Cornhuskers wrapped up the national college crown and continued unstopped through the '71 campaign. In pro football's main attraction, the Baltimore Colts beat the Dallas Cowboys in the Super Bowl in an era-filled contest decided by a field goal seconds from the finish.
9 seconds showing on the clock. The Cowboys and the Colts all tied up at 13-13. It is a 32-yard field goal attempt. Morrill is kneeling. O'Brien is ready. There is the snap. The kick is up. It is long enough. It is
The Colts won 16-13. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier figured in the richest, most ballyhooed event of the year. Their heavyweight title fight at Madison Square Garden in New York was a $40 million extravaganza, but the ex-champion had his troubles.
This guy I really think the guy's kind of sick in the head, really. Because some part of the fight he rapped off and said, "Don't you know I'm God?" He keeps saying it, you know what I mean? Every time he throw a punch, you know, "Don't you know I'm God?" And I got under some of them punches and I said, "Well, God, you're going to get whipped tonight."
Joe Frazier scored a unanimous decision to beat Ali. In hockey, the Boston Bruins set records galore, but the Montreal Canadiens came out of nowhere to win the Stanley Cup, edging Chicago in 7 games. Lou Alcindor, now known as Kareem Jabbar, with help from Oscar Robertson, guided the Milwaukee Bucks to the NBA championship. The Utah Stars grabbed the ABA title, and UCLA won still another National Collegiate Basketball crown, the Bruins' 5th in a row. There was drama in horse racing as an Argentine long shot, Cañonero II, threatened to win the coveted Triple Crown. But the Cinderella story ended in New York as Pass Catcher took the grueling Belmont Stakes.
Moving fast, but at the wire, Pass Catcher is the winner. He is the winner, and on the inside, Jim French is second. Then they cross the wire close with Bull Reason and Cañonero II.
Cañonero wound up 4th. Al Unser was victorious in the Indy 500 after many news representatives were injured in a pace car accident. Tennis, dominated by the Rod Labers and Billie Jean Kings, was infused with new blood. 2 young ladies, Yvonne Goolagong and Chris Evert, surprised some of the veterans of the women's game in some mighty significant tournaments. Lee Trevino won 3 national golf championships, the U.S., British, and Canadian Opens, but Jack Nicklaus set an all-time money-winning record, over $244,000 earned. In baseball, a flashy left-hander with a flamboyant name, Vida Blue, sparked the Oakland A's to a Western Division title in the American League. Baltimore won easily in the East. The National League saw the Pittsburgh Pirates and San Francisco Giants finish first in their respective divisions. But in the World Series, another shocker. After dropping the first 2 games, the Pirates came back and whipped the Orioles in 7.
1 strike pitch to Retman. Right up the middle. Hernandez in back of second base. Throws from there, and that's the series. Pittsburgh wins.
2 other less publicized sports emerged during 1971, and they made news on the front pages as well as in the sports sections. Ping pong, of course. And a high school dropout from Brooklyn, Bobby Fischer, moved into the World Chess Final by virtue of a victory over Soviet Tigran Petrosian in a much heralded series in Buenos Aires. This is Dick Stockton, WBZ, Boston.
Throughout 1971, nature withheld any real fury she might have felt against the humanity that was busy polluting her planet Earth. The year was not marred by natural disasters, except in California.
The interior of these homes are a shambles. It looks like somebody came through with a mixmaster. This morning, our alarm...
Early on the morning of February 9th, telephone reports poured in to Group W station KFWB in Los Angeles, and the extent of the earthquake damage became known, centering around a veterans hospital in San Fernando.
115 to 120 persons were apparently trapped in the 2 buildings when they collapsed. Right to now, approximately 25 to 30 have been extricated. 7 fatalities are confirmed. We know of at least...
Final count on the damage was 500 million, and earthquake-related deaths came to 65. If you were a believer in speed, 1971 produced disaster of another kind.
I just don't think that the SST is the symbol that this country needs for national prestige and for national priorities. I believe there are other things in this country that need to be done, and I hope that those who voted against funding of the SST will now...
Congress was not in a mood to spend more money on the supersonic transport, and on March 19th refused to continue the funds. William Magruder, government chief of the SST program, was deeply concerned.
My heartfelt sympathy to the families that are going to be affected by this, and I hope that we can find some way to ease that transition in the very near future.
The SST was a Boeing baby. For a number of months, one of the other aerospace giants had been suffering from an acute case of near bankruptcy, and on May 6, Secretary Connolly sounded the call, government to the rescue.
The President is going to send to Congress a request for legislation to enable the government to provide $250 million in loan guarantees for the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. Lockheed is not only a very important airframe manufacturer in this country, it is the nation's largest defense contractor. Overall, in its corporate work, it has 35,000 subcontracting companies, not people, but companies throughout the country. The impact on this economy in the event of the bankruptcy of Lockheed would be enormous in my judgment.
The plan had many supporters. Senator Hugh Scott.
The vote against the loan guarantee bill, in my opinion, is a vote for unemployment.
Others viewed it as a clear government handout to big business at taxpayers' expense. Senator William Proxmire.
We don't show that kind of consideration for little business or show that consideration for farmers is inequitable and unfair and discriminatory and just a matter of giving in to the big clout, the big power, economic power and political power of big business.
But despite its financial troubles, the aerospace industry had 2 lunar trips to brag about. Apollo 14, launched January 31st, had trouble when it came time to dock the spacecraft with the LEM prior to leaving Earth orbit. The docking thingamajig was obstinate.
Well, we better back off here and think about this one, Houston.
It's Stu Russo and Ed Mitchell reporting that, at least at this point, they're unable to get a capture. We'll stand by. Okay, that tells us right there that the capture latches are indeed cocked, and that kind of says that there's something in there that's keeping us from releasing them when we go ahead and dock.
We got some, Houston. I believe I got a hard dock.
It worked on the 6th attempt when Stuart Russo backed the capsule off and jammed the 2 ships together by rocket power.
We then got barber pole on both, went grain on both at the hard dock.
Roger, Al, that's great.
Super job, Stu.
Apollo 15, launched on July 26, would prove that men on the moon were more useful than machines. Astronauts James Irwin and David Scott picked up a rock thought to be 4.5 billion years old, the stuff from which both Earth and Moon were made.
Guess what we just found? Guess what we just found? I think we found what we came for. Crystal and rock, huh? Yes, sir. You better believe it.
Yep, sir.
Plage in there. Almost all plage. She likes it. As a matter of fact, oh boy, I think we might have ourselves something close to an orthosite. Because it's crystalline in there. It's just a bunch of, just almost all plants.
As the year closed, a Mariner spacecraft circling Mars signaled that the dust storms were abating, and a much better view of the red planet might be a highlight of 1972.
Satchmo is dead. He died in his sleep this morning, just 2 days after he celebrated his 71st birthday on Sunday, July
1971 saw the passing of men and women who shaped history in their time. Dean Acheson, Thomas Dewey, Bennett Cerf, Igor Stravinsky, Nikita Khrushchev, Whitney Young, Philip Wiley, Ralph Bunche, and the man the world had come to love as Satchmo, Louis Armstrong.
Perhaps his wife provided the eulogy. He died happy, she said, and he left a lot of happiness. Happiness. The legacy of Louis Armstrong, Satchmo, dead at 71. This is Stan Brooks.